Hey, John Gilroy here. You can use Google Map to find your house. Today, we look at an internet map to find the threat. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest today is Matt Lembright, Global Lead of Censys Search, and that's Censys. Matt, how are you today?
Great, John. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I got a Google map. I pull out the map on the phone. I find stores. I find, if you're going to a wedding, you got to find a church or something. And try to think of a real simple parallel to start off with what you folks do. And when I went to your website this morning, it's a lot about this internet map thing and finding the bad things on the internet. And so let's start off with that. I mean, what does Censys do, and how can they help my govies, especially with this map concept?
Sure. Great point. Great analogy. I love it. I use it myself. And it, to your point, the same way you can use Google Maps to find a restaurant, you can also use it to find a historical landmark, or maybe even find a water well in your local area. And that's kind of how we've used Censys too, right? Of course, you can find threats, which is, I think, what folks are most focused on. But, the multitude of things that we find through, what we do and what we've perfected, which is scanning the entire internet. We scan the entire internet. Other folks have done it before. But what we've really focused on is frequency, and we've focused on accuracy and a wealth of data, right? So that if you find something interesting, you're not stopping at, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. We try to give you as much information and context around those devices that we see on the internet so that you can say, hey, this belongs to me, or hey, this potentially has an exposure, or this doesn't belong to me. It seems weird. Is it a threat? And then folks can really dive into, whether it's threat hunting, whether it's attack surface management, tracking their devices. And that's kind of what we do, and what we're working to help the government community out with our Sentinel Horizon, working through OD&I, and really expanding that capability throughout the intelligence community as well.
I saw the press release. Yeah, you're working with the big dogs there, aren't you?
We are indeed. It's it's another source of information. I used to be in the intel community, and the more information you have to make better decisions for your assets, the happier you and your boss will be. So
I'm working with titles for this interview: attack surface management, and when I think of surface, I think of physical surface. The floor of your garage, the backyard, the data center. And so when we're talking about what Censys can do, we're talking about when I think of physical, is this like physical entities and the infrastructure? Is that what we're talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So now you're talking about kind of physical operations, where I think the government is particularly interested in, right? Because of course, the dawn of the internet allows us to connect with one another, and kind of the dawn of IoT, right? The Internet of Things. Really, what it is taking those physical processes that were isolated. That maybe it's an oil well somewhere out there, maybe it's a medical device in a hospital, or maybe it's just a clock in your home that you wouldn't be able to access before. And now you can access it through the internet. Of course, that brings a whole host of other issues, like who else can see my thing that's on the internet? And do I want them to be able to see it or manipulate it? So yeah, of course, attack surface can be kind of strictly digital, strictly IT, especially for some of those organizations, or it could be those IT assets that touch those physical processes and functions that might serve a critical function to either a business or an entire community when it comes to critical infrastructure. So,
yeah, and I think that's what I guess we're indirectly talking about IT versus OT. And when I think about OT, because I really dug into it this morning, it's not just the hardware, it's the software, it's the processes and the policies all involved in one package, isn't it?
Exactly. And what I'll tell you about the world of OT, and of course that, if you're familiar with the world, operational technology, that includes things like industrial control systems, or ICS, or SCADA, those devices that folks use to monitor operational processes. But the tricky part is that there's been a lot of ubiquitization in the IT world, right? There's a lot of standard manufacturers when it comes to firewalls and software and all those things that we're kind of used to seeing, at least at the corporate enterprise level. But we get into OT, that becomes less so the case. There's a lot less known about it. So, what one device can support in terms of software, another can't. And that's where really having that intricate knowledge of those devices so that we can find the protocols that are less common, because you can't find those things if you're not a student of it like our engineers have been. You won't know what to look for, and you'll miss them. And missing them is not an option for governments that are trying to keep the lights on, that are trying to keep the water flowing. Or keep the oil flowing, for that matter, like we saw with Colonial Pipeline. Not having that knowledge is going to be a detriment. So that's really where we focus, so that we can possibly get as much, like you said, software. You don't think of software when you think of some of these devices, but they might be connected to something that has software, or it might be a robust a device that does have some software that needs upgrading, and that's what we look to find through our platform.
So, Matt, this is an audio interview, so people can't see us. If this were video, they'd say, hey, Matt's the young guy and John's the old guy. Yeah, okay, I'm an old guy. What old guys know is that companies have started and they've maybe manufactured devices and gone out of business. And now young guy Matt walks in the room and goes, Ronco, what's this Ronco thing? And this is what's happening here. And it happens in software. Okay, but what if it's in an oil pipeline in North Dakota and Matt's got to fly to Pear, as they call it, and drive out to it? This is a problem that the federal government faces.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, you hit on a great topic. And the reason I like to talk about this is there's a couple things, right? Is that, connecting things to the internet is easy. Protecting them once they're there is difficult, right? And you talk about the manufacturer that goes out of business, or, even the manufacturer that typically works through a reseller or, some other partner where, once it goes off their shelf, they kind of lose visibility of it. And the scenario that you just proposed right there, you have a lot of times, oil engineers, water engineers, electrical power engineers, that all of a sudden they're IT people, but that's not how they think about themselves. That's not what they went to school for a lot of times. And a lot of times they're out there by themselves at a site, right outside their pickup truck with a laptop, trying to figure out if they're doing it correctly. Or, it's a rural, local IT shop that's hired to instantiate some of these things. And so you have the manufacturers who know how things are supposed to be configured, but they can't always ensure that happens when it gets down to that user level. So that's where, what you talked about it, of course, we've got the internet, which is great, but at the end of the day, personal relationships are critical, right? Knowing who to pick up a phone and call if you find something that's in a certain area that shouldn't be exposed, because if we can see it, that means the attacker can see it. So time is of the essence there. And at the end of the day, to your point, this equipment isn't meant to last 1 or 2 years. It's manufactured to last decades sometimes. So institutional knowledge is definitely a part of it. So you get the old hands that are out there, and we need to make sure that information is passed on, and it can't just be, well, I hope Joe talks to Susie when she takes over. I think that's where building a community of engaged folks that have routine exercises and conversations about what's out there and how best to protect it are just critical to protecting all of us.
Okay, here's a scenario here. So last night I am in front of this computer here. I turn it off and it goes, "Will update, shut down, or restart." And update in 3 minutes and shut down. Bang, I walked away and come back this morning. Hey, bingo, bango, bongo. That's a technical phrase.
Yeah.
Bingo, bango, bongo. It's all updated. I'm happy. It works great.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back to that oil pipeline in North Dakota.
Yeah.
Well, wait, you just automatically update that? Really? And how do you know which ones are updated, which ones aren't? And even if you do know that, which ones are vulnerable? And so this gets to be, it's just like, no, it's not just like I've had these notebooks been around for 30 years. Of course they figured it out. But this is a problem that it's not obvious, is it?
No, and you bring up a great point too, because the other little possibility too is that we've run into with quite a few folks that we've spoken with is it reboots and it was configured correctly before, but it for whatever reason, it goes back to factory default. And now those, telnets and login screens that were supposed to be hidden from everybody are now exposed again, right? And so that's what we're focused on, right? Is, if you're not hitting those endpoints as routinely and as quickly as we are, if you're not extracting that data back, you're not going to know those types of things. Of course, you need to, make sure you know where you're looking first. But yeah, to your point, it's, trust but verify, right? I think that's kind of the critical part, and having folks think about, number one, like you said, ease of access, right? How critical is this thing? How quickly do we need to get to it if we don't see it online today, or we find out, to our rapid response capability, when we find exposures and vulnerabilities in software, if that drops, where do these things live and how quickly can we get out to them? I think that's kind of one of the critical parts, kind of zooming out a little bit in terms of just security planning, is determining criticality of these assets, and then either the capabilities or limitations in affecting those changes that will help secure them, are all part of the calculus. And I think, again, to your point, it's not just the company that owns that asset or the organization. It's the other organizations that work to keep it safe and to keep folks updated on all those things. Because we understand that there are large oil rigs out there, and then there are very, very small oil rigs. My dad used to work with some of those companies, and they don't have the capacity to know all that at once. But that's where scaling, discovery, like we aim to do, and we're helping the government with, comes into play, so that we can leverage the exposures that on the bad side of the coin. We have IT exposures that are linked to physical devices. On the plus side of that, we can leverage that the way that we are, so that we're more aware than our adversaries are about those issues.
Now, Matt, I like telling silly stories about pipelines in North Dakota, and we joke about it, but there is critical infrastructure that the federal government's responsible for. And may not be a pipeline. It may be something to, I don't want to go down too many roads here. But so where can Censys, CENSYS, so where can Censys help the federal government manage critical infrastructure?
Great question. Yeah. So I think what you touched on here is kind of a, almost an existential problem, might not be the right word for it, but you've got the government, and while they're responsible for critical infrastructure, their responsibilities kind of butt up against the responsibilities of those, private organizations that run a lot of the utilities that we have, right? And so we look at, the NCSCs like in the UK, or Belgium CCB, where they've put together programs about, really it's focused around community engagement. It's around identifying those stakeholders, building a relationship with them, establishing communications, and doing things like joint exercises. So what that does is it builds a level of trust. And I think that's kind of the chasm that the U.S. government's trying to instantiate with a lot of the utilities, because, in any sector, regulation is a challenge, and it requires more effort. And we understand that. So what we're doing is allowing, the government to see what's already out there, see the information that's already on the internet. And instead of coming to some of those organizations and having to ask, what assets do you have, and where are they, and how exposed, or what are your issues, that some of those that's work for those organizations, right? So the more that we can take away that initial work and give the U.S. government, the visibility that some of these nation state threat actors already have, and say, we're already coming with helpful information. We're already coming with what Censys has already seen, not only seen, but what we can prioritize based on the exposures that we've seen, the risks that have come out, the vulnerabilities that have dropped, that Censys can now identify in less than 24 hours. They can come with a peace offering, if you will. They can come with a gift to some of those organizations versus coming with questions. They can come with answers, and that's what we seek to provide, are those answers and insights that make everybody's life easier, get everybody on the same page, and at the end of the day, protect America and their assets abroad. So
Matt, let's go back to the old guy, young guy construct we started off with. There's a real old guy, a guy named Tip O'Neill, who years ago, before you
Wow.
were born, he
Yeah.
said, all politics is local. I remember that quote. So let's apply it to
Mhm.
your world. Can you say that the responsibility for critical infrastructure resides with the local government? Maybe Tip O'Neill was right, huh?
Oh yeah, I 100% agree with him on all accounts. It's yes. At the end of the day, and that's why I say stakeholders. The responsibility is multifold, right? Because again, at the end of the day, if my sewers back up and I don't have water, sure, I might call the utility, but they'll get overwhelmed, right? Eventually, a local politician is going to find out about it. A local government representative is going to find out about it. They're going to be the ones that are going to be in front of the television screens having to answer questions, right? So that's what we're trying to get ahead of, is making sure that all these partners aren't pointing fingers and wondering who has the answers. They're working together, and that's where kind of a lot of this showing up with the information that Census has, right? Making sure that the local leaders know that we have this information that they can, even if they don't have, not all, local organizations have the capability to invest in IT, but that's where partnerships come in with the state and maybe even federal. But understand having those kind of conversations where there are skills, where there are needs, and communicating those effectively and technologically so that they can be bridged is absolutely correct. So yeah, I mean, and that's the other part too, is that it is local. And part of it is just knowing who your neighbors are, right? Knowing who owns these things. And that's, I think, step one, because that's the other kind of beauty of this, is that we can discover exposed systems, in geographic regions. Sometimes they let us know who owns them. Sometimes they don't. That's kind of the challenge with some of these OT type devices that are out there, is that they're not meant to be on the internet, so they don't announce themselves the same way a website would. But if you have the local government folks who know, I know who my water providers are here. I know who the energy providers are here. That's a short list of 6 names that I can call right now and ask them about this one issue that I think might be a problem. And now what could have been a months-long issue, or could have been a press conference about a breach, is now you just doing your job and defending the citizens. So that's what we're about. That's why we get up. That's why I get up every day and get excited to come to work. So
Matt, and my turn to brag here. I once went through East Palestine, Ohio,
uh-huh.
and I've been to Mingo Junction, a lot of places in rural Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
So last year, East Palestine, Ohio had an incident with the railroad there, and I think many people discovered that the railroad has sensors in their tracks. And
Mm-hmm.
many people didn't know that. Well, I think we got some OT here, don't we? Now, what I have seen happen is you get a person with a hat on, and hey, I'm an IT guy, and this is how we manage our IT stuff. And then we'll do the same thing with the railroad sensors. And then Matt sends, wait a cotton picking minute. This is not IT. You don't manage IT the same way you manage OT. This is a substantially different approach. And we talked about human beings and physical assets. I mean, this isn't something you can't, update a router in Seattle from Houston or something. There's some subtlety here, and maybe this transcends into maybe more physical security too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's because, to your point, right? And I wouldn't proclaim myself to be an OT expert, but I know the folks, I've talked with some of the folks that are, and to your point, a lot of the principles in IT, like, well, just update the software, or just turn this exposure off, or you don't need this login screen. Sometimes that's the only way to do it. So either you lose the capability entirely, or you have an exposure, and that's where OT, IT engineers, those are conversations that need to be had together in groups so that they can effectively accept and manage risk. Physical becomes definitely part of that equation, especially when we're talking, in remote rural areas. A fence does no good if nobody's watching the fence, right? If a fence is there, it's just a matter of time how long it takes somebody to climb it, right? I think, to your point, I mean, you look at places like, back where I spent a stint of time down in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where there wasn't any cyber attack involved. There was just one person with an assault rifle shooting at a power transformer, I believe it was. So, or you look at on a wider scale, Ukraine and Russia, right? Of course, there's been cyber attacks throughout the entire conflict, but at the end of the day, if Russia wants to turn the lights off, they send missiles. They don't send packets over the internet, especially if they need it done quickly and verifiably. So, physical considerations need to be part of those conversations too, because to your point, in rural areas, if you have anybody can buy a high-vis vest and walk and rent a truck from Enterprise Rent-A-Car and drive up to whatever site they want, open up a laptop, and a lot of folks will say, well, maybe they're a contract, I don't know who they are, but now that that physical separation is now moot. They've arrived at the location, even if they can't get there through the internet. So, but again, that's where knowing where these things are, whether it's in the digital kind of theoretical space or whether it's in the physical space that we occupy. So, 100%.
Well, Matt, if you've listened to this podcast so far, you're probably a card-carrying nerd, and so we got to do a little nerd talk here, and I wanted to keep this to the end, but I casually tossed out OT and IT. There's another term called IoT. There's all kinds of terms being thrown around here, and so maybe to appease our listeners with more technical orientation, so maybe you can just split the three up for us.
Sure, and this is Matt's semantics. I know the industry is. I think, to your point, they're used interchangeably. We probably need to get some good lexicon solidified around that. But at least the way I think of it is the way I think of OT, I tend to think of more kind of industrial capacities, right? This is kind of where we talk about the either remote water station or maybe a manufacturing plant, things that are connected with I would say direct physical operations, right? Where that line kind of blurs is when we get into IoT, right? Which is, Internet of Things, right? Which is, okay, now they're still physical devices. There's still some physical output, but it's kind of on a lesser scale. At least that's how I look at it. They need to be integrated. So I think of things like we see like building controllers, things that control thermostats and things like that in buildings where maybe the function isn't as explicit. Of course, I'd say the line blurs because a lot of times we find these things and they tend to be part of hospitals and other things. That's where a little bit more sleuthing is required to kind of determine attribution. But that's kind of how I think of it. A lot of times, too, is the IoT are kind of the jumping off point, right? That's a lot of times what attackers will use to gain a foothold and then pivot to some of those sensitive databases that they actually care about. Whereas if you gain control of an OT device that controls a specific function, your end state has essentially been reached as an attacker. And then IT is kind of just the, how I view the apparatus that keeps all of that flowing, right? So really focused on the digital data versus physical operations. And the point being is that those OT devices, those IoT devices are layered on top of, or underneath, some of those IT operations and devices that you see out there. So, it's the internet. It's all connected at the end of the day. And really, where you get into some of those more specific conversations about, industrial control systems or SCADA, that's where really knowing the manufacturers and understanding their protocols, which is, again, what we focus on in addition to all the other things that we focus on. But it's an important part for us because in order to effectively identify those things, you have to become a student of what they do, how they function, pull up the user manuals. And that's what our research team spends a lot of time doing because we know how important it is to not only our government customers, but, the folks that keep those things running and, us as citizens. So.
Matt, you used the word lexicon. I wrote it down. Then I went to your company website, and CENSYS has a glossary, and it's called the Census Cybersecurity Glossary. And what I'll do is I'll include a link to that in the show notes page. So if you're out there walking your dog and listen to Matt, and you want to learn more, and this is very, very thorough and detail-oriented. It talks about asset discovery, attack surface management. So it'll answer. Maybe this will resolve some debates to have between people saying OT and IoT and
yeah. Well, and it's important too because it helps helps us define our perspective, right? Our perspective is outside in, right? Because we know, to us, the attacker is going to see it, then that's the most important piece. And so that's where we start as well. I liken us as to use your Google Maps before kind of the satellite of the internet. We're just faster and we have more details. So, we're that ever present eye that can, see those devices that are out there and pick them up within, minutes or hours of when we.
Well, there's a title, The Ever-Present Eye. I use that as the title for the interview. Well, this has been a lot of fun. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I would like to thank my guest, Matt Lembright, Global Lead of Censys Search. That's CENSYS. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Thank you, John.